You know, it's quite interesting to hear that they attribute us with what we see in their behaviour. And I've had that said to me, that I'm a coward and I have no social conscience because I was scared of a little prick.
That's it.
Whereas I look at them and think they're scared of little cold, and where's their social conscience? It's a funny business, this, and it's going to be something that has changed us all forever.
I think so. Now, I've got an even bigger story for you.
Oh, yes.
So, we were teachers, we were mandated to take the vaccine, and we chose not to do so. And this would have been in late October, around October of 2021. We had been, both my wife and I, working as casual teachers in local schools from here down to the Southern Tablelands, from Goulburn and right through to, through to Bowral here. And when the lockdowns took place, and they were, I can't remember how many there were or what the duration was, but it seemed to go on for a year or so.
It's horrible.
And during the period of time, many, many months in which these lockdowns took place in New South Wales, permanent and temporary contract teachers were sheltered in place, was the words the department used. So they sheltered in place by staying at home almost entirely, and casual teachers were drafted in to supervise the students of parents who were, in inverted commas, essential workers. And in, for example, Goulburn, those essential workers were essentially medical staff of the local hospital whose kids went to state high schools. So, and given that COVID was likely to be far more prevalent in the community at that time than the authorities were letting on, and I've seen some data on that, we as casual teachers were actually supervising kids who were continually exposed to the potential for COVID in their parents' workplaces. And as a consequence, we were continually exposed to the virus, at least to some extent, maybe light doses and so forth, but certainly kids were getting sick with respiratory sort of symptoms. And we were in close proximity in the middle of winter in closed classrooms. And the only protection we had, of course, was the face nappies that, for 100 years we've known have had no effect on the transmission of a respiratory virus. So we worked as casuals on restricted hours, so we were penalised in the sense that we weren't able to work as much as we would have liked to have done. We were maybe getting a couple of days a week.
And you were unvaccinated, wasn't that?
Unvaccinated at that time. Well, this is 2020 predominantly, but right through to 2021.
I'm surprised they still accepted you.
Well, they did until the mandates kicked in October 2021. So not only were we accepted, but we were at the forefront of the fight against COVID. There were lockdowns in place and all of that sort of stuff. So, and we did that without any protections whatsoever. Of course, there was no vaccine available, regardless of whether we wanted it or not. And we were obliged to spend, hours in the company of people who could potentially be infected, and we weren't, as casual teachers, even eligible for sick leave. So there was we were just on the front line, like cannon fodder, if you like, in an environment in which we were told that this was an extremely deadly disease. So that was the background. The mandates kicked in, and immediately the Department of Education, and a shout out to Murat Dizdar, Secretary of the Department of Education, we were told that if we were to set foot on school grounds after a particular date, that the police would be called. Subsequently, the Department of Education fired thousands of staff and for failing to meet their obligations under this mandate. And they weren't just fired, they were fired for professional misconduct.
Oh,
right?
How much have we heard that? How often?
Now, think about this. In a local school environment, the unvaccinated were characterised as being not only a threat to the health and well-being of staff and students, but a moral threat. We were, and at that time, if you looked up at the definition of an anti-vaxxer, which is how we were explicitly described in a Sydney Morning Herald article involving the head of HR for the New South Wales Department of Education, the headline was anti-vaxxers, will be dealt with. To be described, to have your career ended, and this didn't happen for casual staff for technical reasons, because we're not technically employed unless we're actually in a school. If you were a temporary contract or a permanent teacher, the numbers of those who were fired for professional misconduct. Now, professional misconduct is something reserved for things like fraud in the Department of Education and kiddie fiddling. Now, that is how thousands, and Mark Latham presented numbers in the New South Wales Senate, and according to him, I think from memory, the number was 14,000 staff had their services terminated for professional misconduct. Their numbers were denied by the Department of Education in Parliament, and a week later, 2 senior executive staff left the employment of the department, having been, I assume, busted for misrepresenting those figures. Now, we weren't dismissed for professional misconduct, but we received letters threatening this from the department. When we subsequently, and it was some 7 months later after the mandates kicked in, when we subsequently received medical contraindication certificates enabling us to work without being vaccinated because we had had a recent COVID infection. I had no symptoms at all. I wasn't aware of having been infected, but my wife and 2 kids had the virus, and we were granted medical exemptions on the basis of tests.
Only for 6 months, though, wasn't it?
At the time, it began at 4 months, I think, and then it was cut back by the department or the state government to 3 months. So we received eligibility to work, I think, at the time for 3 months. So we returned to the department to work with our COVID vaccine exemption certificates. Now, bear in mind that even the TGA said that a recent infection, was as good as immunisation, although obviously a lot better in hindsight. When we made the return to work, instead of us simply being allowed to work on the same basis that a fully vaccinated teacher might be able to work, we were obliged to enter into a series of procedures which exposed our vaccine status to, I don't know how many staff in the New South Wales Department, right? Completely unnecessary, and it was unnecessary because the Department of Education had failed to even document procedures for the return of unvaccinated staff. It's as if they hadn't considered the possibility, right? Now, as a consequence of those failures of due process, which I confronted the most senior executives in the department with, our privacy was breached on multiple occasions, and we were subject to discrimination on the basis of our vaccination status. Quite specifically, a local high school principal, when I approached her for work, I received an extremely positive response, and then it suddenly went cold when our vaccination status was made explicit, because we were asked for our vaccination certificates. So I gave her the exemption certificates. Now, we had been told by somebody that a refusal to employ us was on the basis of our vaccine status. Now, whether or not that was true, and this guy could have been a delusional fantasist, but 4 times under oath, she admitted that she didn't understand that an unvaccinated person with an exemption certificate was even eligible to work. So we know that we were precluded from working on the basis of our vaccine status, even if it was in error. Now, that wasn't sufficient even for us to make a complaint to the department about the way we were being treated. we got work elsewhere, and the proof of, and then it gets worse, the department then subjected us to a procedure for which there were no written a process for which there were no written procedures. So instead of allowing us to simply, and the schools were crying out for staff by this point, okay? So, and we've had a teacher crisis for years, and I can get into that. Instead of just simply allowing us to go and work at schools that were crying out for us, who had contracts in hand, ready to go, the New South Wales Department of Education precluded us from working until this undocumented process had been complete. Well, that undocumented process took, I think, 3 weeks in my case, after a lot of bullying on my part, 6 weeks in my wife's case, before the department, one directorate of the department would sign off on us being eligible to work. But meanwhile, HR had signed us off immediately to say we were green-lit for employment within the department. So I was able to get work, and my wife was able to get work, in schools other than those that had offered us contracts immediately, and we were working there while at the same time being precluded from getting contracts at schools that had offered and where we had worked previously. Now, in the process of mishandling our return to work, and thank you again, Mr. Disdar, Secretary of the Department of Education, as a consequence of this gross incompetence and mishandling of our return to work, our privacy was breached on a number of occasions, and our unvaccinated status was broadcast to all of the schools in the local community. They all talk, and bear in mind, I would say around in this area in particular, in Bowral, I'd say upwards of 95% of people were vaccinated. And having been the subject of this vilification in the Sydney Morning Herald, and in letters from the department, asserting that we would be, the police would be called if these filthy unvaccinated, science-denying people were found on school grounds. Our reputations within the local schools communities were destroyed as a consequence of the department's actions.
I'm so sorry to hear this.
Yeah.
We're the only people, you and your wife, the only people who suffered this indignity.
In the local area that we know of, yes. I know of plenty of teachers who had the smarts to pretend to have got vaccinated and had the fake certificates on their phone and so forth, but we chose not to do that for a number of reasons, one of which was we weren't going to break the law because of the irrational behaviour of the state government. We were going to, if we weren't allowed to work, we would not work. Anyway, so then it gets worse, because when I went to Secretary Murat Dizdar with a complaint about the manner in which we'd been treated and the breaches of our privacy and so forth, we were then subject to a cascading series of breaches of law and due process by the New South Wales Department of Education, failures to abide by its obligations under the Privacy Act, to conduct a Privacy Act in, what was it called? An internal investigation, which they were obliged to do under the Privacy Act in New South Wales. So we were subject to a series of these breaches of law and due process, compounding the consequences of the initial problems that we'd actually complained about.
So it was widening the circle of people aware of your situation.
Yes, and of course, again, it's schools and teachers are generally relatively conservative. So the damage to our reputations was irretrievable, frankly. So my wife had worked in the local area for 15 years, had terrific relationships. I'd worked in, most of the schools in the local area in the Southern Tablelands. And the Department of Education opposed us so we had to end up going to the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal to have the fact that our privacy breaches were not properly investigated. It's even weirder. So we go to the tribunal and say, we want an administrative review of the decisions of the department, which were that no privacy breach had taken place. And they said, well, we can't do that because they haven't done the internal review. And I said, well, that is the problem. And thank Christ, what happened was a senior member of the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal granted us a jurisdictional hearing. The department was obliged to undertake the internal review it had previously failed to undertake. And then we had the opportunity to appeal the decision that the initial tribunal hearing found. And as a consequence of this process, we accumulated this vast and unprecedented body of systemic corruption of law and due process in the way in which the Department of Education handles its complaint management procedures when it comes to casual and temporary staff, and particularly those it finds unacceptable, i.e. those who refused the mandate.
That is shocking.
And I'll tell you, it gets worse, because there is literally no mechanism, and this is anybody thinking of becoming a teacher in New South Wales, know this. The vast majority of you will start as a casual or temporary teacher, and you will have absolutely no enforceable rights at work, regardless of the scale of the misconduct to which you're subjected. There is no mechanism under procedures for any recourse or remedy associated with any scale of breach of abuse of contract. And the only remedy is workers' compensation. And as it happens...
That would be hard to get.
Well, as it happens, we ended up on workers' compensation because in January of, 2024, it became so apparent that there was no possibility of the Department of Education acting in a manner that was either consistent with law, consistent with any of its procedures, or even just, exhibiting any integrity whatsoever. And we were under incredible duress, and we made an application to the department and subsequently to Allianz to go on workers' compensation because we were obliged to go back into the school environment carrying the weight of me in particular having to and this was in the middle of this tribunal process, and I was up against the Department of Education, and Secretary Murat Dizdar himself appointed the Crown Solicitor in opposition to us, and and was personally instructing the Crown Solicitor in opposition to us. So we ended up with, I ended up with 5 days, I think, of me versus the Crown Solicitor and the entire might of the New South Wales state government.
You self-represented?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and let me tell you, my 92-year-old mother, who, by the way, has had, I think, 8 COVID vaccines, but she's Irish, and she's bulletproof, so I think I'll live to about 130.
Hope so. After that onslaught.
So I had to face down the Crown Solicitor. I've never encountered such a lack of integrity and incompetence on the part of. I always thought that the bureaucracy was incompetent and inefficient. I did not understand the depth of the depravity of these agencies. There is nothing left in terms of integrity. So that's an ongoing process. So it gets better, and then Allianz, which was the service provider to the New South Wales government for our workers' compensation payments, after several months of being on workers' compensation, chose to dispute our claims on the basis of fraudulent misrepresentations by, staff of the New South Wales Department of Education. And, self-evident falsehoods were used as the basis for disputing our claims. I brought that self-evident evidence to the attention of Chris Minns, Prue Carr, who's off work with a sickness that has arisen since 2021. I brought it to the attention.
Baffled by that.
I know. I brought it to the attention of Secretary Murat Dizdar, who had a sudden health event in late 2021. I brought it to the attention of Courtney Housas, the current Minister for Education. brought it to the attention of the Ombudsman. The Ombudsman refused to investigate the matter. I brought it to the matters of fraud to the attention of the Police Commissioner, and the local area commander refused to see the evidence before deciding not to proceed. There is a total collusion amongst these incompetent bureaucrats to preclude anybody holding them to account.
Daniel, you say 14,000 people were dismissed in this.
According to Mark Latham.
Has anyone joined in your struggle? Have they commended you?
Wow, thank you for the question. Because the shout out to the New South Wales Teachers Federation and also to TPAN, the Red Union representatives of teachers. The New South Wales Teachers Federation is actively hostile to any casual or temporary teacher who has an issue with any permanent colleague. And the reason is because, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, Henry, head of the New South Wales Teachers Federation, but the New South Wales Teachers Federation will not represent you in opposition to any fellow member. Now, in the case of a permanent staff member, your employment contract is with the department, but in the case of a casual or temporary teacher, you are effectively employed by your permanent colleagues in your school. And if you've got an issue with any of the way you're treated under contract, the New South Wales Teachers Federation will not represent you. So, I took the matter to Red Union. They were equally disinterested in providing me with any support whatsoever.
Yeah. So they protect those who you're trying to...
Yeah.
It's shocking.
And it gets worse. I think, and the other side of it is there's a bit of a Stockholm syndrome associated with this as well. And that is that you get virtually no support from your colleagues. You'll get sympathy and you'll get positive words, but it is absolutely in a coercive, corrupt and incompetent organisation like the New South Wales Department of Education, there is no incentive for anybody to stick together with you if you are on the outside.
And they're all paying their own mortgages and wanting to keep their noses clean.
I don't blame them for it, but that's the reality of it.
It's disappointing.
You're on your own.
It's a lack of courage.
Yeah, then nobody's coming to save us.
Daniel, has your reputation in your area now been restored? And that, I imagine your children might have suffered as a result of this.
Firstly, I don't think our reputations can be restored in the schools environment because...
Socially, has it been restored?
No. I would say that as a consequence of the... my apologies.
That's all right. That's okay.
As a consequence of the disparagement to which we were subjected by the Department of Education in, as I say, I think the headline was something like anti-vaxxers will be to be investigated by the New South Wales Department, and the first paragraph was that they would be investigated and summarily dismissed for professional misconduct. As a consequence of a series of disparagements in writing by the New South Wales Department, letters to all staff, saying that the police would be called if you were found on premises. And then as a consequence of sticking your head up and actually objecting to the manner in which we've been treated, nobody really wants to, in the schools environment, really wants to have a direct association with you.
It's been very cool.
I will say that the one exception to that was the school that I was working at when we finally went on workers' comp, and I was thoroughly supported by that principal and that school and the staff there. But in every other school, our reputations were fundamentally damaged, and as I said to the principal when I was leaving, I'm not sure that I would even want to impose on him having me back, given the profile that I've now achieved within the department, because I've held a mirror up and I've managed to ensnare a large number of executives at the top level in this scandal.
And could you bring yourself to work in such a poisonous and inadequate environment
It's
again.
not a safe environment for us to work in anymore, because the school's environment for everybody is fraught with the potential for problems, because you can be accused of anything, all that sort of thing. So, as teachers, we always wore that, secure in the knowledge, really ultimately, that, like the vaccines, that I was secure in the knowledge that, or I thought I was, that the department would act objectively and do an investigation and reach a rational and reasonable conclusion about whatever might happen. I never had problems particularly, but if I did have problems, I thought that the process, I could rely on the process.
Well, you could easily be accused of something quite sinister and have no, and that would leave.
I can be quite sure that if I was accused of something quite sinister, that the Department of Education would take the opportunity to ensure that I never worked again. So it's not a safe place for us to be. And frankly, it's not a safe place for any casual or temporary teacher, because casual and temporary teachers do not have any recourse or remedy associated with an abusive contract in any form in the school environment. And more to the point, they can't afford to make a complaint because they know that there'll be no positive outcome. There is no possible positive outcome available. So the only consequence for making a complaint can be that you will lose your job, you lose your relationship with the school that's employing you, and there is no mechanism for redress.
Daniel, this has been a fascinating conversation. We've been chatting now for quite some time, but I think it's been very important for the public to hear this. One thing I would like to hear is whether your children have had ramifications from this situation. Have they suffered any kind of backlash from their friends?
The answer to that is no, but mainly because I don't think my kids were late teens, and my youngest is now 13, my oldest is 19. So both were in school for periods of time, but both have also been home educated. So the effect on them there hasn't been a direct effect on them as a consequence of being unvaccinated, because I think a lot of kids are unvaccinated, and I don't think it's an issue for them. But I will say that the impact on them of having both of their parents unable to work in their chosen career as a consequence of the corruption and of due process within the New South Wales Department has been enormous. They also were not, and it was a big consequence of the department's characterization of us as a threat to the health and well-being and the morality of the school environment that caused my 92-year-old mother to think that I was a bad person. And we were basically incommunicado for several years, and my kids never went to their 90th birthday party for their grandmother. So thanks for that as well, Murat.
It's extraordinary how people can be influenced. Even those who've known us best, they can be turned. It's been a life lesson for a lot of us.
It has.
Daniel, thank you so much for coming and talking with us. I'm sure there are many people who'll be interested. In fact, someone I interviewed the other day at Merimbula had a similar situation. Would you like to close with any final thoughts on what you've endured? Yeah.
We have given the Department of Education and Allianz Australia every opportunity to back down and to withdraw these disputes of our workers' compensation. So neither of us have had income now we both stopped working effectively in January of 2024. So we're nearly 2 years into this process. But we have, and you can look forward to this, our applications to the tribunal will be submitted in due course, and our cases will be heard at the Personal Injury Commission in New South Wales, which I can only cross my fingers and hope is not as corrupt as every other government agency I've dealt with to date.
Daniel, we will be most interested to hear the outcome of this, and I'm sure a lot of people will be wanting to know as well.
Yeah.
And I hope it opens the floodgates for a lot more of your courageous action.
Well, thank you.
And thank you so much for coming and speaking to us here at the ABN at the Vax Bus.
And then if I can say thank you to all those who might listen to this at some point, who have stood up for yourselves, stood up for others, or just shared information that might better inform those around you. So thank you too.
We must all keep speaking up.
Yes.
Thank you, Daniel, very much.
Thank you.